What's going on, everybody? Josh Engleman for Awesemo.com, and I am back with my final NFL top 5 for the season. It's week 17. We're done with these things. Now be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all of our other content goes live. Follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman so you can see the updates to these sim results as we get closer to lock. Finally, let me know in the comments section, who are your favorite quarterbacks, running backs, wideouts, and tight ends on DraftKings for week 17. We're starting at the tight end spot, rounding out the bottom of the top 10, Hayden Hurst, Jordan Akins, Dalton Schultz, Noah Fant, Mike Gesicki. JONNU Smith is my number 5, 3,800, looks like a solid value. We've got some better options. Who will be in the top 4 of my tight ends? It should have been top 5, but I didn't realize I typed a 5 and I'm not re-recording this. So, who will be the top 4 tight ends? Who will be the top 5 at the other positions? It's time to find out. All right, number 4, 5,800, projected for 13.8 fantasy points. That's Mark Andrews. Ravens taking on the Bengals monster favorites. 13-point favorites with a 44-point total. Bengals defense, not very good. Lamar Jackson, spoiler alert, going to rank pretty high. So if you do want to stack him, I don't mind it. Andrews shows up in the optimal lineup 9% of the time. There's not a huge difference in these top 4 tight ends. There's not a lot to be found. $5,800 Mark Andrews kind of exists in the middle. Happy to get there. This is that kind of matchup, but you're always worried that the Ravens are a little bit healthier on the ground than they are in the passing game. But once again, I expect to be going to Mark Andrews, but I've got 3 tight ends that are ranked higher. First of which shows up in the optimal lineup the exact same amount of times as Mark Andrews. $7,100 Darren Waller, 15.9 fantasy point projection. This game is at Denver. Raiders 2.5-point favorites with a 51-point total. Raiders D, not great against the run. Broncos D, not great against the run. Pass defense ranks 11th in passing DVOA. Waller with a 5.2% chance of going for north of 30 fantasy points. If you have the money and you can spend up a little bit further, going to Waller over Andrews certainly works. If you need the savings, I see them as equal plays, so don't be afraid to go to either one of them. Coming in number 2, a play I really like if you're looking to save some money, 3,700 for Evan Engram, 11.7 fantasy point projection. Giants taking on the Cowboys. They're 2-point dogs, 45-point total. Cowboys defense, 24th against the run, 20th against the pass. This is a really nice spot to save a little loot. Engram showing up in the optimal lineup about 10% of the time. You're not expecting the monster. The odds of him going for north of 30 are pretty low, but this is where you want to go if you need to save some salary, to spend up at running back, to spend up at wide receiver. And at number 1, pretty clearly, in fact, 6K, George Kittle, projected for 15.5 fantasy points. Niners taking on Seattle. They're underdogs, 7-point underdogs, in fact. Seattle's pass defense, not all that scary. 46-point total, so you're expecting San Francisco to throw throughout the game. Kittle goes for north of 30 fantasy points 4% of the time, which is enough to put him in the optimal 12% of the time. That is more than Evan Engram. That is more than every other tight end on the DraftKings slate. That makes George Kittle my number 1. Now we transition over to the wide receivers, rounding out the bottom of my top 10. Brandon Cooks, DK Metcalf, Jacoby Myers, Marvin Jones Jr., and finally, Adam Thielen on the outside looking in. My favorites at wideout start now. Number 5, Allen Robinson, 7,700, 18-point fantasy projection. Bears taking on the Packers. You're expecting them to have to throw. 4.5-point dogs with a 50-point total. Packers defense is league average. Nothing you have to worry about. Robinson can hang a big game, though. 17% chance that he goes for north of 30 fantasy points. 11% chance that Robinson ends up in the optimal lineup. The $7,700 price tag is pretty high, given what else exists on the slate. But from a ceiling perspective, against the Packers, especially if they have to try to keep up, love getting to Allen Robinson. Next up, number 4, 7,200, A.J. Brown, 18 fantasy point projection. Tennessee at Houston, big favorites, big time total, 56.5. And the Texans defense, probably the worst in the league, or at least close to it. 30th against the run, 29th against the pass. You know that A.J. Brown has a monster ceiling. He goes for north of 30 fantasy points 15% of the time. And he takes a little bit of a step up over Allen Robinson, shows up in the optimal 12.5% of the time. That puts him 4th overall for the slate. Love getting to him. 7,200 seems like a perfectly reasonable price tag for someone with his sort of ceiling. This one is where it gets tricky. $8,500 Calvin Ridley coming in number 3, projected just shy of 21 fantasy points. The problem here, at Tampa Bay, the number 1 run defense and the number 5 pass defense in Football Outsiders DVOA. But Atlanta, 6.5 point dogs, 50.5 point total. You expect the Falcons to throw nonstop in this one if they want to try to keep up with the high-end offense from Tampa Bay. Ridley can really hang it on them. 24% of the time he can go for north of 30 fantasy points. That will be an essential score for you. He shows up in the optimal 13.4% of the time because you're going to need that big score. 8,500 is no joke. But that's a spot that I want to be because there are a few guys on the slate that have the upside of Calvin Ridley. We drop back down into the 7K range, $7,600 Justin Jefferson, just shy of 20 fantasy points at Detroit. Big favorites, 6.5 point line, 54 point total. And the Lions are the owners of the worst pass defense in DVOA. That stands out to me as a really good sign that I should roster some Justin Jefferson. Goes for north of 30 fantasy points 20% of the time. In the optimal lineup, 15% of the time. That's just shy of the number 1 receiver for week 17. As if there were any other options, 9,200 Davante Adams. He has been killing it this year. Projected for 24 fantasy points. Taken on the Bears. 50 point total. Tough Bears defense, but it does not matter. Adams transcends defensive matchups. Goes for north of 30 fantasy points 33% of the time. Oof. That is just bone chilling. He's so good. That's what happens when you have a Hall of Fame level inner circle tier quarterback like Aaron Rodgers. We'll talk about him in a little bit. 18% of the time, Adams shows up in the optimal lineup. You can see that's a nice step up over Jefferson, an even bigger step up over Ridley. If you have the salary, and you should certainly try to find it, Davante Adams is the best wide receiver option on the slate. Now we move it along to running back Malcolm Brown, Darwin Thompson, David Montgomery, Chris Carson, and Melvin Gordon the third round out the bottom of my top 10 running backs. Now it's time for the top 5. This one's a new one. Number 5, Latavius Murray, 5,600, projected for 16 fantasy points at Carolina. They're favorites. You're expecting them to run the ball. 47.5 point total and a bottom 20s defense on whether it's the run or the pass. Lat Murray is going to soak up some usage. Alvin Kamara out, COVID protocols. He's not going to go crazy. 6% chance of north of 30, but man, does the floor look good. 11.5% chance Lat Murray is in the optimal lineup. This is the spot where you save some money at running back. Next up, in a tie with Lat Murray, wins the tiebreaker. Number 4, Aaron Jones, 7,100, 18 fantasy point projection, taking on the Bears. Tough run defense for the Bears. This one does give me a little bit of pause, but that's not a reason that you shouldn't play people just because it's a scary matchup. Salary matters. Projection matters. Aaron Jones goes for north of 30 fantasy points, almost 11% of the time. That's the same rate that he is in the optimal lineup. If you can't find the money to go all the way to the top, I like checking out this 7K range. I love grabbing Aaron Jones. Perfect pairing with the guy that he's tied with, Lat Murray. Coming in number 3, Jonathan Taylor, 7,400, 19.4 fantasy point projection for Indianapolis, taking on the Jaguars. Big time favorites, 14.5 point favorites, 49.5 point total. Jags defense stinks. Taylor should see a ton of carries. If they get out in front early and it's because of Taylor, he's going to see a monster workload in the second half. 15% chance going north of 30 fantasy points. 13.5% chance of being in the optimal. You see, we took a little bit of a step up over Aaron Jones. We've got 2 more to go, and they're really on their own tier. Number 2 is 6,300 DeAndre Swift. 18 fantasy point projection, taking on a Minnesota Vikings team. The Lions are pretty sizable underdogs, 6.5 points, but a 54 point total. If this game stays relatively close early, I love it for Swift. This is the 27th ranked run defense. That is not something that I am super worried about, though. 12% chance of going north of 30. 15% chance of being in the optimal. If you're trying to pay up more at wide receiver, let's say you're trying to go to that Ridley Davante Adams pairing. Maybe you're going to DeAndre Swift and Lat Murray, saving a bunch of money at the running back spot, grabbing 2 of my top 5 guys. Or you're paying up for number 1. And that number 1 is Derrick Henry, 9,400, just shy of 23 fantasy points, taking on a Houston team that is totally terrible. 7.5-point favorites, 56.5-point total, and a 28% chance of going for north of 30 fantasy points. This dude can hang it on people. 16.6% of the time, Derrick Henry is in the optimal lineup. Great pairing with the paydowns for Swift and Murray. If you want to go a different direction, pay down at wide receiver, combine these guys, go to Henry and, I don't know, Jones, Henry and Taylor. That's another situation that you can put together. I think that you could really mix and match these running backs at the top. It's relatively flat. 16.6%, not a huge number for being in the optimal. That's what happens when there's so many games on the slate. So you can really mix and match at the top. I like being pretty concentrated in some of these guys, particularly my top 5. So I'd rather go ultra heavy on them with every combination you can find. We're closing it out at quarterback, but before we do, one last reminder, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman so you can get the updates. You don't want to miss it. Now, on to the quarterbacks. Rounding out the bottom of my top 10, Cam Newton, Mitch Trubisky, Drew Lock, Matt Stafford, if he's playing, and Derek Carr. There's not a lot separating most of these guys. The top 5's not all that interesting, but my number 1 has separated himself from the pack. Number 5, we've got Aaron Rodgers, 7,400, 21 fantasy point projection, taking on a Bears defense that is good, but we also have a 50-point total. Goes for north of 30 fantasy points 18% of the time, but it's really, really difficult to separate out these quarterbacks. Shows up in the optimal 4.9% of the time. That could just as easily be the number 9 spot for Mitch Trubisky. What you're looking for are great pairings for stacks, and you know you have one, Aaron Rodgers to Davante Adams. Number 4, 7,700, Deshaun Watson, just shy of 23 fantasy points, taking on a Tennessee Titans team that is 30th against the pass. They're going to have to throw a lot. Texans are underdogs with a monster total. There should be a ton of fantasy points here. If Watson can get in on the ground, even better. He's in the optimal 5% of the time, but what you're looking for, he can go for north of 30, almost 24% of the time, and that's what you're going to need out of Deshaun Watson to put him in an optimal. It's a scary spot, but I do like the defensive matchup. Now, if you need to save some salary, this spot looks fantastic. Phillip Rivers, 6K, 20.5 fantasy point projection, but he's got a date with the Jags. 2 touchdown favorites, a 50-point total, in the 31st ranked pass defense. That's what I'm looking for. 6% of the time he's in the optimal. He can go for north of 30 about 16% of the time. Not the true ceiling like everybody else, but you're also going to save north of $1,000 by going to Rivers. Really nice spot in week 17. Now, if you want to pay up, the opposite of Phillip Rivers, you pay $8K for Lamar Jackson, 24.5 fantasy points, 2 touchdown favorites against Cincinnati. Not a great defense. Lamar, a monstrous threat to score on the ground. I love getting to Lamar here. I think he's well worth the 8K. And if you want to pair him with Mark Andrews, feel free. 28% of the time, he's going for north of 30 points. He's in the optimal 6.6% of the time. That's close to number 1. But it's not my full number 1 option. The number 1 quarterback for me this week is Kirk Cousins. He's 6,300, projected for just shy of 22 fantasy points, and he's taking on a Detroit Lions team that stinks. They're the 32nd ranked pass defense. They're 6.5-point favorites, and the total is well north of 50 points. He goes for north of 30, 21% of the time. He shows up in the optimal 7% of the time. You can easily stack him with Justin Jefferson. You can easily stack him with Adam Thielen, 2 guys that show up in my top 10. Stack him with both for all I care. It'll all look really good. Kirk Cousins is the guy that I want the most of this week. I assume he's a little popular, but having 2 elite wide receiver options to throw to affords you all sorts of additional combinations. If you need to get to Marvin Jones Jr. as a bringback in the Detroit stack, I think that looks great as well. Kirk Cousins, the number 1 quarterback for week 17. Alrighty, folks, that will do it. Those are my NFL DFS contenders on DraftKings for week 17 in the NFL. We'll be doing some playoff content. We'll probably have some blended videos like this moving forward throughout the playoffs, but this is the final week of the regular season, so please check out, thank you for watching this video. Check out my FanDuel version. You should see a link for it around here somewhere. And good luck this Sunday for week 17 in the NFL.